What do you get when you mix H.P. Lovecraft, Richard Stanley, Nicolas Cage, and alpaca milking? Well, you get yourself one bonkers little movie.
It's just the color. But it burns.
I'm Lindsay, and this is my review for Color Out of Space. Color Out of Space, a short story written by H.P. Lovecraft. This film is directed by the infamous Richard Stanley in his return to directing after the incident that happened when he was tapped to direct The Island of Dr. Moreau, starring Val Kilmer and Marlon Brando. If you do not know that story, I highly recommend the documentary Lost Soul, The Doomed Journey of Richard Stanley's Island of Dr. Moreau. It's absolutely fascinating, the behind-the-scenes story about what happened with him directing and what he's done since, and check it out. And it's starring Nicolas Cage. So we've got a lot of crazy elements going on in this film. To begin with, the basic storyline is there's this family, they live out in the sticks, and one night a meteor crashes in their front yard. And over time, this substance that is within this meteor starts to infect the flora and fauna and eventually the family, and shit just goes fucking crazy and ends in this giant crescendo. And the one thing that defines this meteor and the power that it has is this color that doesn't exist in our spectrum. Hence the title, Color Out of Space. It does differ from the original short story by H.P. Lovecraft in that it's updated, and in the original story, the events are told to someone because they happened in the past, but in this one, all the characters exist at the same time and it is happening to all of them. But other than that, it follows it pretty well. The things I liked about this film is there's a steady but escalating progression to the infection and craziness of events. I think the pacing is well done. Stanley is a very cerebral filmmaker, and that fits really well with Lovecraft's story and his storytelling and the imagery that he uses in his stories. I thought he did a very good job of bringing that vague descriptiveness to life. And the other thing that I really enjoyed was the actual color, because you do see it in its pure form, but you also see it within different creatures and plants and reflected off of different surfaces like ice and mirrors and water. So it takes on that otherworldly effect. Even though it is a mix of like pinks and greens and purples, it still looks very alien when it's put through this filter that he does. He also brings out some pretty decent performances at times from the actors. That sometimes the acting is a little sketchy, but especially capturing the mania and desperation and just insanity. I think he did a very good job with the actors.
I don't even know what color it was. It wasn't like any color I'd ever seen before.
He also did this thing with the family where at the beginning you get to see their dynamic of how they relate to one another, and it's pretty dysfunctional, but throughout the course of everything ramping up, they sweetly and horrifically are drawn closer together. It's kind of hard to explain, but I think it was kind of a cool way that he did that, using the family dynamic mixed in with this story. One thing where this film does lack, the special effects in some parts are not the greatest, but I'm sure budget-wise it wasn't easy to get really great special effects. And this is a film where you would need heavy special effects. to tell the story. But they do use a lot of practical stuff, which is really well done. There is one scene of body horror, which is one of the more disturbing things that I've ever seen, especially given the context of what's happening. And it's very gruesome and gory and icky, and it's done very well, and it's extremely creepy and unnerving.
Everything's gonna be A-okay.
And then after the movie was over, there was a Q&A live streamed, hosted by Patton Oswalt, which was great because he's such a huge fan of stuff like this and he really knows his films. And it was just Richard Stanley and Nicolas Cage that he brought up. He brought up the rest of the cast after the first initial question and answer period. But first it was just Stanley and Nick Cage. And Nick Cage comes up and he's dressed as like the human embodiment of a wallet chain. It's about the best way I describe it. I'll put a picture up. And Stanley is there with his, you know, his hair and his black suit and his talisman that he's wearing. And I swear to God, they were just trying to out crazy one another. But at one point, Stanley was going so far out there that Nick Cage had to reel him back in, which is really saying something. But it was really enjoyable to watch. And during this Q&A, Stanley announced that this was the first of a trilogy of H.P. Lovecraft that he's doing. And the next one is going to be the Dunwich Horror, which I think will be great. I think him returning to making films again is just awesome because he's a very creative guy, and I'd like to see what he would do with these stories. And I think him and H.P. Lovecraft's work really complement one another. So I'm excited to see what he does with Dunwich Horror, and I'll be really excited to see what the third is going to be. So overall, I would highly recommend this film. It's not a great film by any means, but it has some really interesting things going on with it. Some very creepy and horrific and interesting images. And it's definitely something to see and kind of pick apart and analyze. And I'm excited that Richard Stanley is back, and hopefully Nick Cage will be involved in the other two as well, because I think their mania and insanity kind of feeds off one another, and that's all for our enjoyment.
Well, that's gonna do it for this review. As for me, this is Lindsay signing off. I'll check you later.